Good afternoon, it's Teresa, and we are back in the garden for Acts chapter 27. Today is the exciting shipwreck that I promised you from last week. Paul is on the ship. Chapter 27 starts with, "When the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius." Now remember, Paul is being sent to Rome to stand before Caesar Nero because he has requested to go before Nero because he was not getting a fair hearing in Caesarea. So here we are in Caesarea. This is where Paul starts his journey in Caesarea, right here. He was placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, and he was a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left on a ship whose home port was Adramyttium in the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. This is the province here. As you can see, they stopped at Tyre and Sidon. The next day when we docked in Sidon, right here, Julius, that's the captain that was given charge over Paul, was very kind to Paul and let him go ashore and visit with friends in his church so that they could provide for his needs. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds. Now, there's a wind that blows in a counterclockwise direction here. It's called a northeaster. And they're already hitting these winds. It wasn't safe to travel after November, and this was in October. And Paul is going to tell them, I don't think that this is a good idea, but they don't listen to him. These ships did not have motors. They had sails and rudders. And they were at the mercy of the wind. And so, putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north of Cyprus, thinking that they could get a break from the wind there. And they sailed in between the island of Cyprus and the mainland. See, here they go here. Keeping to the open sea, we passed along the coast of Sicily and Pamphylia right here and landed at Myra. Myra is right here. And that's the province of Lycia. There, the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria. Alexandria is down here. In Egypt, they were called the breadbasket. They provided grain for everyone in the whole known world. And so ships would sail from Alexandria and they would make ports. The ships that they were on were cargo ships. They were not passenger ships. And so they were at the mercy of all the different stops that the ship had to make. This is how the ship captains made their money, delivering grain to all these places. So the Egyptian ship was bound for Italy, and Italy is all the way over here. Rome is where Paul is essentially going to go, and they're over here. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Caudia with great, let me go back here. I'm sorry, I got on the wrong place. We had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty, we finally neared Cydnus, but the wind was against us. So we sailed across to Crete. So they're here. They are going very, very slowly because the winds are pushing them back and pushing them back. And I don't even think they had oars. I think they were just going with the sails to get where they were going. So the wind was not really for them. They were having a hard time catching the wind in the sails. I don't know if you've ever heard someone say, he is the wind in my sails. That means the wind is blowing the ship where it's supposed to go. and they're not going very fast. The wind was against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island. We went past the Cape of Salome right here. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Haven. This is near the town of Lasea. We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall, and Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. "Men," he said, "I believe there's trouble ahead if we go on. I believe we're going to be shipwrecked, and there's going to be a loss of cargo and danger to our lives as well." But the officers in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner of the ship who was on board than they did with Paul. And since Fair Haven was an exposed harbor, it was a poor place to spend the winter. It was not a very fun town, and all of the crew wanted to go up here to Phoenix because in Phoenix there was a lot more action. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure up here. But a light wind began blowing from the south. There's the wind that's blowing up this way. The sailors thought they could make it to Phoenix, so they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength called a northeaster burst across the island and blew us out to sea. I want to explain about this wind. This wind would go counterclockwise like this, but it was a very strong wind. It was typhoon strength. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Caudia, and that's right here. They were not making very good time at all because the wind was blowing them back. Every time they would go a little bit forward, the wind would blow them back. And there was a lifeboat that was following behind the boat, and it kept banging up against the ship. And so they pulled the lifeboat on the ship, and they took ropes and chains and put around the hull of the ship because these ships were wooden, and if the winds and waves hit them hard enough, the whole ship would just break up. And so they put ropes all the way around the ship's hull to try to hold it together. This was to strengthen the ship. They were afraid of being driven across to the sandbars of Syrtis off the African coast. Now this is the African coast here. I've got Egypt down here. That's the African coast. And there was this land mass. It was a mass of sand. And it would be blown by this wind and the waves, and it would go all the way around Crete here. And especially down here around Egypt. This sandbar mass would move from one place to the other. It was kind of like a Bermuda Triangle, and it's still to this day this way. So that the men were afraid that they were going to run up on one of these sandbars of Syrtis. This is called the Syrtis sandbar right here off the coast of Africa. They lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. The wind was blowing them all over the place, so they lowered an anchor to keep them from being just tossed to and fro. The next day, as gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. This was a very hard thing for them to do because this is how they made their money. But now they weren't thinking about making money. They were just thinking about saving their lives. So they started throwing the cargo that they were carrying, the wheat that they were carrying, overboard. They also, the following day after that, started throwing the ship's gear overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars, until at last all hope was gone. These were seasoned boatmen, sailing men that knew the seas very well, and they knew how to handle the winds, but they knew how to go by the stars at night and the sun during the day. But the storm was blocking out the sun, and the storm was blocking out the stars, and they didn't know where they were going. But no one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, "Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete." He tried to get them, remember, to stay and winter over in Crete. But those young men, they didn't want to do that. They thought that they could go ahead and sail over to Phoenix. Now they're out in the middle of the Adriatic Sea right here, and they're caught up in this wind channel. Paul says, you could have avoided all this damage and loss if you had listened to me. But take courage. None of you are going to lose your lives, even though the ship is going to go down. Last night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, "Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar." That meant Paul was definitely going to get all the way to Rome. Remember, God had already told Paul he was going to go to Rome and stand and testify before Caesar Nero. So God had told Paul the night before, no one is going to lose their lives. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, Paul, for I believe. And Paul's saying, so take courage, men. I believe God, and that it will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island. Don't you know these men were looking at Paul and thinking, well, who is he to tell us what to do? We don't have to listen to him, but you know, he was right about not leaving Crete. About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, they had been in this storm for 14 days and nights. Midnight on the 14th night of the storm, as we were driven across the Adriatic Sea, they're driven across here, the sailors felt like land was near. I don't know if they heard waves crashing. I don't know how they knew, but they knew that land was near. Remember, I said these were experienced sailors. So they dropped a weighted line. This is called sounding. Whenever they would know how close the shore was, they would drop a line in the water, and then they would, when the anchor hit, they would make a mark on the rope, and they would pull it up, and they would measure the rope. And that's how they would know how many feet was to the bottom. And every time they did another sounding, they would be closer, and it would be a shorter amount of line that they put out before they hit the bottom. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was 120 feet. But a little later, they measured again and found that it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they were afraid they would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know what the shoreline was going to look like. If it was going to be a sandbar they were going to get stuck in, or if it was going to be rocks and cliffs that the boat would slam against. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to get in it. And they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You're going to die unless the sailors stay on board." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat the leftover wheat that they still had on the ship. And he said, "You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks. I imagine some of them were seasick. You know, when the waves are going back and forth. And there were 276 men on this boat. There were men that were Paul's friends that had said they were Paul's slaves. That's the only way they were able to travel with him. And there were 276 men altogether on this ship. He said, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. I said this a minute ago. You've been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks. Please eat something now for your own good. These men needed to keep their strength up. Not a hair on your heads will perish, I assure you. Then he took some bread. He gave thanks to God before all of them and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat, all 276 people who were on board. And after eating, the crew lightened the ship even more by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. They knew they were near land. I suspect that Paul was ministering to these men as he was telling them to eat. I believe that he was telling them about Jesus and how he knew that God was going to save all of them and how he trusted in his God. I imagine that there were some men that became believers on this trip, don't you? In situations like this, people do tend to cry out to God. When the Twin Towers were hit years ago, there were more people in church for about a month than there had been in almost 100 years. Sadly enough, it didn't last very long. But when tragedy strikes, people cry out to God. And these people were crying out. And Paul was right there on board. You might wonder why God allowed Paul to go through all of this stuff. Paul didn't care. As long as he was able to spread the gospel, he trusted God to take him wherever he needed to go. Paul had been shipwrecked several times. Paul had been beaten, thrown in prison. He had done many things to be able to spread the gospel. When morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. Then they lowered the rudders and raised the foresail and headed towards the shore. But they hit a shoal, one of those moving sea banks I was telling you about. They hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship stuck fast while the stern was repeatedly being smashed by all these waves that are still being blown up by the wind. And the boat began breaking apart. I want to say something about these 4 anchors that they cut loose when they tried to run towards the shore. Those anchors are in a museum on this island of Malta right here. And they just say, ancient Roman anchors. In the 1960s, there was a skin diver that was reading all this, and he went and found an area that had a bay where 2 seas run together, the Mediterranean Sea and the Adriatic Sea. He started taking his scuba diving men and going down and searching. They found those 4 anchors. It just proves that the Bible is true. There is proof. I started to say living proof. Anchors aren't alive. There's proof in many ways that the Bible is true. And these were the anchors that were cut from the ship. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners. The ship was being broke up, and the Roman soldiers were responsible for these prisoners. And if these prisoners swam to shore and safely got away, whatever was going to happen to the prisoners that were on board would have happened to the Roman soldiers. So some of these Roman soldiers, they wanted to kill all the prisoners to make sure none of them escaped, and they could honestly say, we kill them. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul. Remember Julius? He was the nice commanding officer that had allowed Paul to go to Sidon on shore and meet with the people at the church. He was a kind man. I think that Paul probably converted him on this trip, and he didn't want anything to happen to Paul. He had began to love Paul. So he wanted to save them. He did not let the men carry out their plans. He ordered all who could swim to first jump overboard and make it for land. The others could hold on to planks or debris from the broken ship. So everyone escaped safely and got to shore. I don't know if you have ever been in a life-threatening situation or not. If you have, I bet it was a time that you cried out to God and asked Him for help. And you know, when we cry out to God and we ask for help, He always comes. Even in the little things. There was a lady that had driven from out of town. She's a good friend of mine. And she was going to have to wait several hours at my office to get a massage. She wanted to get a massage before she went back out of town. And she was sitting out in the waiting area of my office. And when I came out, she said, "This sounds horrible, but I've been praying that your 4 o'clock appointment doesn't make it, that maybe they have a flat tire or something. I don't want anything bad to happen to them, but maybe they could have a flat tire or something to hold them up so that they would have to reschedule for later." And I just kind of smiled at her because I knew the man that was coming at 4 o'clock. He never cancels. And I went over and sat down at my desk and I picked up my phone, and sure enough, that man had sent me a text and said, "I'm sorry I can't make it. I've had a flat tire. Do you have a later time that I can come?" I thought that was amazing, that God hears even our smallest concerns. The man did come later to get his massage. It actually cost him about $300 because he had to call the service to come replace his tire. But this woman really needed a massage because she was very stressed out, and she really needed to get back home before dark. She is a daughter of the Most High King. The man is a son of the Most High King also, but I know that God brought him the resources to get that tire. And it was a safe blowout. If it hadn't happened then, it might have been a dangerous blowout. God always coordinates things according to His will. We think we're in charge. I thought this man was coming at 4 o'clock and that I was going to work on her at 8 o'clock. But God had other plans because she cried out and asked. I want to encourage you to ask God for the things that you need in your life or the things that you require in your life. He's always right there. Remember the passage, "You have not because you ask not." I'm going to see you next week in the garden, and we're going to learn how Paul gets bit by a poisonous snake when they land on this island of Malta right here. He gets bit by a poisonous snake, and he just shakes it off. I'm going to see you next week in the garden. Till then, remember, God loves you, and I love you too.